Excellent. Well, I'm Luke Witten. I'm an all-grain brewer, an avid hop grower, and a bit of a scientist, so I like to play around with things. So the first thing that you need to ask yourself if you're going to grow hops in Queensland is actually why you're going to do it. Because of the shorter day length, the yields can be quite variable. Sometimes you can get good yields, sometimes yields are really bad. So you need to ask why you would go about that. Initially when I got into it, I thought, I'm a gardener. I was paying like $12 for 90 grams of hops, so I thought, you know what, I'll grow some hops, save myself a bit of money. With the costs of fertilisers, trellises, pots, garden beds, mulch, and all the rest of it, and when you consider that the Aussie dollar is so high and you can get hops delivered to your door for as little as $30 a kilo, from a financial point of view, it's probably not worth doing. However, it is very satisfying to grow your own hops, and also if you've actually ever tasted a wet hop beer, you wouldn't even need to ask why you would want to do it. The unique flavours that you get from using wet hops in your beers are unattainable by using dry hops. We don't have hop growing regions nearby in Queensland, so the only way that we're actually going to be able to utilise wet hops is to actually grow them ourselves. So you've decided to grow hops. How are you going to go about it? The first thing that you're going to have to decide is whether you're going to grow them in a pot or whether you're going to grow them in the ground. Both of those have their pros and cons. With pots, the biggest pro is the fact that you can move that pot around. If you don't know where you're going to be in 6 months, if you're renting or something like that, it's probably best to go with a pot because digging your plant up out of the ground mid-season is definitely going to affect the vegetative growth and you'll probably get a lower yield. With a pot, it's also easier to control soil conditions because you know exactly what's been put into that pot, and it's also easier to correct deficiencies. Also at the end of the season, it's easier to dig up the rhizomes because you can just tip it out on the ground and search through it and then chop all the rhizomes up. Some disadvantages with pots is the fact that it can be smaller. If you're using a small pot, it means smaller plants, which means smaller yields. It can also be more expensive because you've got to buy a pot, you've got to buy a potting mix, and sometimes you may need more fertilisers. With the ground, the major advantage of using the ground is the fact that it's a larger root mass. Now, that root mass is uninhibited and it can spread as far as it wants to get, which means that it can get more nutrients, which means that the plants can get much bigger. However, it is unmovable then. So if you find a spot in your garden and in summer it was a good position and in winter it's not getting as much sun, then that plant has to stay there, and if you do dig it up mid-season, your growth is going to be seriously stunted. I actually like to use a combination of both methods where I'll start my plants in a pot, move them around the garden, find a spot that's actually quite good, and then plant it in the ground. So the soil type is the next decision that you'll have to make. With pots, I recommend using a premium potting mix. The cheaper ones that you can get at the supermarket for $2-3 a bag, I've found them not to be very good. With potting mix, you basically get what you pay for. Searles Premium Potting Mix is a pretty good brand. I know another brewer in Bundaberg who uses Searles Premium Potting Mix only in big pots, and he gets really good yields using it. It's just a good potting mix. In the ground, you want to have a soil that's really rich, full of organic matter, lots of worms, lots of mulch, slightly acidic, and you want your soil piled up so that you have good drainage. I also mulch my hops just so to save water because I'm on tank water, and it's just a good thing to do to make more organic matter in the soil. The location has been the biggest obstacle I've found in growing, having good yields with hops. The biggest thing that I've found that seems to stunt their growth is the wind. Where I grow my hops in Bundaberg, it's quite coastal, and we have wind all day, every day, all the time. So you need to find an area that's quite sheltered. In saying that though, you also need lots of sun. Because we have a shorter day length to traditional hop growing regions, we need to maximise the limited amount of daylight that we have. So you've got to find an area that's sheltered and also has as much sun as possible. When you're finding your location, you also have to consider where that plant's going to be in 6 months' time. If you're growing next to a shed, which is nice and sheltered, it might be fine for the first 3 metres, but what's that plant going to be doing once it's 6 months old and 10 metres tall? So you have to really consider where it's going to be. The other thing to consider is in summer, where the sun in the sky is, in winter, the sun's going to be in a different position. So what might be a really bright and sunny spot in summer could actually turn into a bit of a shady spot in winter. So these are all things that you need to consider. So you've got your plant, perfect location, it's either in a pot or in the ground, it's growing well. How are you going to look after it? First of all, hops have 2 phases of growth. They have a vegetative phase and a flowering phase. During the vegetative phase, the plant's just growing upwards, getting bigger, and just providing heaps of area on that plant to produce lots of flowers. During this vegetative phase, the plant needs lots of nitrogen, just so it's got the elements it needs to just get bigger, and you'll need to use high nitrogen fertilisers. I actually use a hydroponic fertiliser. Generally, these are formulated for cannabis, which is a close relative, and also cannabis has a similar life cycle with the growth and flowering phase. So during the vegetative phase, I use a vegetative hydroponic fertiliser. Because the hydroponic fertiliser is a complete fertiliser and is designed to be used in a medium with no nutrients, you don't need to put it on at the recommended rate. I actually put it on at 1/4 of the strength or even 1/8 of the strength of the recommended rate. I'll make up 10-20 litres and just give every plant a couple of litres every couple of weeks. And this just ensures that the plant has all the nitrogen it needs, all the potassium, all the phosphorus and all the micronutrients. Slow release fertilisers can be good early on in the season. However, if it's a slow release fertiliser that's high in nitrogen, and if you put it on late in the season, such as in January or February, you might actually create a situation where you've got high nitrogen levels in the soil in that flowering phase. And you don't want to, and I've found that having high nitrogen in that flowering phase can actually impede the flower growth. So whilst slow release fertilisers are nice and easy to use, and they're fine to use early on in the season, try to avoid them later in the season. I wouldn't be putting them on slow release fertilisers on past January or February. Actually, no, not even February. January would be the latest for slow release. During the flowering phase, which is late March and onwards, you need to use high potassium fertilisers. Again, I just use a hydroponic fertiliser made up to 1/4 strength, and I find that this is more than adequate. In the between phase, between the vegetative and flowering, so say in March, I won't actually put any fertiliser on unless the leaves go a little bit pale or something like that. And that's just to flush all the old fertiliser out for the changeover. You should do this especially if you're in a pot, because just so that there's no salt build-up or anything like that. So you've got your plants, they're nice and big, packed full of hops. What are you going to do with them? What I do with them is I use them fresh. So I have a pretty big kettle. I've got an 80 litre and a 140 litre. And I will just make mega wet hop beers and just use them fresh, straight off the vine. Just throw them in the pot and I'll cube it and I'll ferment it through the years. I've got wet hop beers during the year. In the past, I have dried them. This works quite well as well. I've got drying racks in the shed, which are just pine wood with cotton sheets over the top. The shed's a pretty cool temperature, especially for Queensland, and it's very dry because it's got a very dry dirt floor. I leave them in there for about a week, and then I just stuff them in bags, vac sack and stick them in the freezer. I don't tend to do that anymore. When the dollar reached parity, I went a bit crazy with buying hops, so I don't need to do that anymore. I think I've got about 15 kilos of hops sitting in the freezer. Something I'm going to experiment with this year is actually making up, say, a double batch and just putting all the hops in it and then freezing them in 1 litre bottles and then just putting those in the freezer. So throughout the year, if I want to get that wet hop flavour, I'm just going to put them in at the end of the boil. Haven't done that yet, but that's an experiment I'm going to try. Actually just freezing, taking the hops off the plant and putting them in the freezer wet doesn't work. I just found that it gives a terrible grass flavour basically. It just tastes like just grass. So I've tried that, didn't work. The varieties that have worked for me, the 2 big winners that have been working for me have been Pride of Ringwood, which is good because I like that variety. I know some people don't. And Chinook. These 2 varieties just leave the others for dead. Cluster works quite well. I haven't grown Mount Hood, but another brewer that I know, Queensland Kev, he grows it and it cranks for him. And it's in a pot as well, so it must do really well. The varieties that haven't gone as well, Cascade, it grew, but it didn't have any kind of significant yield. It's a bit of a shame because I really like Cascade, but it just hasn't worked. Halito did nothing. I put it in the ground and I think it grew about 20 centimetres and it stayed like that for 4 months and then it just died for some reason. There was no rhizome, nothing. It was, so Halito didn't work. However, that's just my microclimate. So I'd say if Halito or Cascade are your favourite varieties, I'd still give them a crack because what works at my place might not work at yours and vice versa. So just get out there and experiment. The biggest thing that I wanted to talk to you about today is propagation. When I was buying hop varieties, they were kind of expensive, so I thought that I'd get out some information about propagation just so that there's more varieties getting around and everyone can have a hop plant vine in their backyard. The most common propagation is actually rhizomal propagation. This is really easy. You dig up the roots, you find a piece of root that's got a little nodule on it like the previous picture, cut this off, stick it in the fridge, put it in the ground next year and you've got a new plant. I don't actually like this method of propagation. I don't like to dig up my plants. I'd prefer to leave the roots sitting in the ground undisturbed so that next year they don't have to put any energy into making new roots. They can just already established and just boost. So I don't really like the rhizomal propagation. However, it does work and it's been proven to work. And if you buy a plant, that's what it'll probably be. My favourite method of propagation is actually vegetative propagation. It's not as common. I've only seen one guy selling cuttings of hops, like vegetatively propagated. I don't understand why it's not popular. It is really easy to do and you can do a lot more plants too. All you do for vegetative propagation is say you've got the vine, you'll have these things called nodes, which is where the leaves come out. So just below the bottom node, you'll chop there, and just above the top node, you'll chop there. Pull off the leaves off the bottom and stick in a glass of water for 2 weeks. You'll have inch-long roots. Take it out of there, put it in a pot, let it sit there for another 2 weeks, and then it's ready to go in the garden. Easy, easy, easy. I like this method better because if you buy, say you're just starting, you've bought 5 varieties, say only one of those varieties works and you want more plants, you can do that vegetative propagation during the season. So it means that you can do it in real time basically. You can also get a lot more plants, like one plant would easily produce 300-400 cuttings. Whereas with rhizomal propagation, you'll get 10 good ones or something, it's just, you get a lot more plants vegetatively propagating. Something I'm actually going to be experimenting with this season is trying to make seeds. I'm doing that by getting a female and putting a hormone on it to actually produce male flowers, and then I'm going to cross it on itself and just see what pops up. that wouldn't be a way to grow known varieties. That's just an experiment that I'm playing with. In finishing, I think everyone should get out there, start propagating your hops, and just spread the vine. Thank you very much.